Have you ever felt cornered by your own family? I was just cleaning the garage when my mother-in-law stormed in, screaming, "Why did you touch my vintage car without asking?" Then she hit me with a bombshell. "I know you've been hiding the inheritance documents from me." I froze, realizing she had been snooping through every folder in the house, but what she didn't know was that I had already sent a single text that would turn everything around. It was just another morning in our quiet suburban home, the kind of day that felt ordinary at first glance but carried the invisible tension that comes with family life. I had woken up early, as I usually do, before anyone else in the house, eager to finally catch up on the small things I had let pile up during the week. The sun was gently spilling through the half-open blinds in the kitchen, casting long, golden stripes across the tiled floor. It was warm, calm, deceptively peaceful. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam curling upwards, and inhaled deeply, trying to anchor myself in the simplicity of the morning, knowing full well that family life rarely stays simple for long. My husband was still asleep upstairs, snoring softly, completely unaware of the storm that seemed to linger just beneath the surface of our home. Our teenage daughter was in her room, headphones on, likely scrolling through her social media feed or watching yet another video that would distract her for hours. And yet, even in this ordinary calm, I could feel it, the subtle, almost imperceptible pressure of someone always watching, always judging. My mother-in-law, a woman whose presence could fill a room without ever being there, had a way of inserting herself into the most mundane parts of life, her influence stretching far beyond what anyone might admit. I moved through the house, starting with the garage, which had become something of my personal sanctuary. It wasn't just a place to park the car. It was a space where I could organize, clean, and feel a sense of control over my own environment. I liked to line up the tools in neat rows, sweep away the dust, and polish the surfaces until they gleamed. Today, I decided it was time to tackle the old family car, a classic vintage model my husband had inherited from his father. It was beautiful, meticulously maintained over decades, and had always been the pride of the family. But, to me, it also symbolized a world full of rules I never seemed to fully understand, unspoken expectations, the subtle tests of patience, and the careful navigation of relationships that could so easily go wrong. As I pulled out the cleaning supplies, I heard the faint sound of my husband's phone vibrating upstairs. A text, maybe, or maybe it was something else. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was absorbed in my own little ritual, the smell of polish, the rhythmic motion of my hands on the leather seats, the way the sunlight caught the chrome details, making them sparkle almost magically. There's a certain kind of satisfaction in cleaning something that belongs to someone else, especially when it's done well, carefully, and respectfully. You feel productive, accomplished, and in control of a world that often feels chaotic. But then, just as I finished wiping the steering wheel, my phone rang. The ringtone was sharp, sudden, and it immediately set my nerves on edge. I glanced at the screen and saw her name, my mother-in-law. My heart sank slightly. There was a reason I always hesitated before answering her calls, because even in the simplest interactions, there was a chance for confrontation, a chance for her to turn the ordinary into something dramatic, unsettling, or even accusatory. I took a deep breath and pressed the answer button, forcing my voice to remain calm despite the fluttering anxiety in my chest. "Hello," I said, trying to sound casual. The voice that came through the phone was sharp, commanding, full of indignation. "Why did you touch my vintage car without asking?" she demanded, every word dripping with accusation, as if I had committed an unforgivable crime. The morning sun now felt less like warmth and more like a spotlight highlighting my sudden vulnerability. I froze, the rag in my hand, the smell of polish still in the air, realizing that a simple, ordinary day had just taken a dramatic turn. It was moments like these that reminded me how complicated family life could be. My mother-in-law had always had a way of asserting control, of stepping into situations uninvited, of making her opinions known loudly, and with an air of authority that brooked no disagreement. And yet, there was also a strange, underlying pattern, a need to test boundaries, to see how far she could push, to create tension that only she seemed to thrive in. At times, it was exhausting. At other times, it was maddening. But it was always inevitable. Even as I stood there, Caught between finishing my morning task and dealing with the unexpected confrontation, I noticed the little details around me, the neatly arranged tools on the bench, the smell of motor oil mixed with the sharp tang of polish, the light hitting the car's chrome bumper in a way that made it gleam like gold. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself a small sense of peace, reminding myself that no matter how dramatic or challenging the situation, I had choices. I could respond with anger, with frustration, or with a quiet, measured intelligence that often had far more impact than a heated argument ever could. As I listened to her continued ranting over the phone, something shifted inside me. I realized that this was not just about the car. It was never really about the car. It was about power, control, and respect, or the lack of it. Every interaction with her seemed to carry this hidden weight, this underlying game of influence that I had no interest in playing blindly. And yet, I knew that how I responded today could set the tone for everything that would follow. One misstep, one wrong word, and the ordinary morning I had hoped to enjoy would spiral into hours of conflict, perhaps even days of tension. I glanced at the polished leather seats again, running my hand over the smooth surface, feeling the effort I had put into making something shine. And in that moment, a thought formed. Perhaps the solution didn't require confrontation in the traditional sense. Perhaps it required patience, strategy, and, above all, a single decisive action that would cut through the noise, the drama, and the expectations. I didn't yet know what that action would be, but I could feel it forming, like a plan silently gathering strength in the back of my mind. Little did I know, this ordinary day, this seemingly mundane task of cleaning the garage, was about to become the turning point of a story I never thought would touch me so personally. The clash between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, the subtle power plays, and the hidden agendas that had been simmering quietly beneath the surface were about to come to light. And all it would take was a single, perfectly timed text message to shift the entire balance of our family dynamics. I took one last deep breath, set the rag down, and braced myself. The ordinary morning had ended. The real story, one of secrets, confrontation, and subtle revenge, was only beginning. As I carefully returned the rag to its hook and glanced at the polished surface of the vintage car, I could feel the lingering echo of my mother-in-law's sharp, accusatory voice still buzzing in my mind. That single phone call had already stirred something I had tried for years to keep under control, the delicate balance between patience and confrontation with a woman whose presence in the family was both unavoidable and, at times, suffocating. My husband, blissfully unaware of the brewing storm, was quietly enjoying his morning coffee upstairs, occasionally humming along to some tune on the radio. But I knew the truth. He, too, had felt the subtle pressure of his mother's scrutiny over the years, though he rarely spoke of it. Family tension, I realized, was never about what it seemed to be on the surface. The mother-in-law's criticisms, the subtle digs, and the moments of overbearing involvement in our lives were like a constant undercurrent, quiet, persistent, and capable of erupting unexpectedly. I remembered a particular afternoon during the wedding preparations of our daughter, where even the smallest choice, like the color of napkins on the reception tables, had become a battleground. "Are you sure that's the right shade?" she had asked, her voice tinged with mock concern, but with an unmistakable edge that felt like a judgment rather than advice. Even now, thinking about that day, I could feel a shiver run down my spine. The wedding, a celebration that should have been filled with joy and laughter, had been subtly overshadowed by the constant need to anticipate her whims and demands. On that morning, standing alone in the garage, I replayed all those moments in my mind. I realized how her behavior had created this invisible tension between us, a tension that didn't rely on overt arguments but manifested in quiet resentment, careful avoidance, and the endless internal calculations of how to act without sparking conflict. My daughter, a sweet and innocent teenager, often bore witness to this dynamic without fully understanding it. She would glance at her grandmother's sharp expressions or hear the pointed remarks, sometimes turning to me with silent questions in her eyes. And I, too, often struggle with how to shield her from the intricacies of adult family politics while still teaching her how to navigate them. I could almost hear her voice in my memory, a mixture of indignation and expectation. "You should have asked first," she would say, or, "Do you even understand how important this car is to me?" Her words always carried a double weight. On the surface, they sounded like concern, but underneath there was a subtle accusation, as if she were testing my loyalty, my respect, and my willingness to conform to her standards. And I understood, even then, that these moments were more than just about me. They were about control, hierarchy, and the constant negotiation of power within a family structure that had been in place long before I had entered it. The garage, my small sanctuary, now felt less like a refuge and more like the front lines of a silent war. Every polished surface, every neatly arranged tool, seemed almost like a shield against the unpredictability of her presence. And yet, despite all my efforts to maintain calm, the tension was palpable, like the quiet before a storm. I could feel it in the air, a heaviness that made the simple act of cleaning a car feel almost monumental. I decided to sit on the low stool I kept for moments like this, taking a deep breath as I tried to gather my thoughts. It was during these quiet, reflective moments that the subtle dynamics of family tension became most evident. I remembered all the small ways she had inserted herself into our lives, the late-night calls questioning minor decisions, the surprise visits that disrupted carefully planned days, the thinly veiled comments about money, inheritance, and proper behavior. Each incident, seemingly small on its own, combined to form a web of control and subtle intimidation. And on this morning, after her accusatory phone call, I felt the weight of that web more heavily than ever. I reflected on the countless dinners where she had arrived unannounced, critiquing my cooking or questioning why certain dishes were served. The family would sit quietly, too polite to challenge her, while I swallowed my frustration, nodding politely and answering her pointed questions with carefully measured responses. Those dinners were microcosms of a tension that defined our relationship, a constant dance of diplomacy, careful avoidance, and the silent calculation of how much to reveal and how much to withhold. It wasn't just about control, it was about the subtle imposition of power that left me feeling like an outsider in my own home. I remember the first time I truly recognized the pattern, during a conversation about our daughter's education. My mother-in-law had pressed questions about every decision we made, as if questioning our competence, our judgment, and our ability to raise her grandchild properly. The questions were polite, almost casual, but they carried an undercurrent of accusation that made my chest tighten. And I realized then that I wasn't just navigating a relationship with my husband's mother, I was navigating a minefield of expectations, judgment, and family politics. As I sat there, absorbing the morning light and listening to the distant sounds of my daughter playing in her room, I knew I had a choice. I could continue to let the tension dictate my day, allowing her subtle provocations to erode my sense of peace. Or I could acknowledge the reality of the situation, recognize the patterns, and begin to formulate a response, one that would protect my family, assert my boundaries, and restore a measure of balance to our home. The tension was real, and it was heavy, but it was not insurmountable. In that quiet, charged moment, I also realized something crucial. Family dynamics are never static. The relationships we build, the boundaries we establish, and the respect we demand, or fail to demand, can shift in an instant. And sometimes, it takes a spark, a single moment, to redefine everything. On that ordinary morning, standing in the garage with the smell of polish lingering in the air, I felt that spark forming. The tension with my mother-in-law, long simmering beneath the surface, was about to escalate into something undeniable, a confrontation that would challenge assumptions, reveal truths, and test the limits of patience, cunning, and resolve. It was a tension rooted in years of observation, subtle power struggles, and the quiet assertion of control. It was a tension that involved not just me, but my husband, my daughter, and the invisible rules of family loyalty and expectation. And most importantly, it was a tension that demanded action, thoughtful, precise, and strategically timed. As I ran my hand along the polished leather of the vintage car one more time, I knew that the calm of the morning was only temporary. The storm was coming, and it would be impossible to ignore. The morning had started with the quiet, almost meditative routine of cleaning the garage, a task I had come to cherish as my personal escape from the subtle chaos of family life. The sun streamed through the half-open blinds, dust motes dancing in the golden light, casting long shadows over the polished concrete floor. I had been carefully wiping down the vintage car, a beautiful relic of my husband's family history, every surface gleaming under my hand. The leather seats were soft beneath my fingers, the chrome detailing sparkling like tiny mirrors, reflecting the calm of an ordinary day that felt almost too perfect for what was about to unfold. Then, without warning, my phone vibrated sharply on the workbench, shattering the illusion of calm. I glanced at the screen and saw her name, my mother-in-law. A sudden pang of anxiety shot through me. I had always known that her presence was never truly optional. Even when she wasn't physically in the room, her influence lingered like an invisible weight, shaping the atmosphere of our home, controlling the rhythm of our days with subtle and persistent force. I took a deep breath, telling myself to stay composed and answer the call. "Hello," I said cautiously, my voice calm but slightly trembling under the undercurrent of dread I felt. Her voice came through, sharp and demanding, carrying that unmistakable mixture of authority and indignation. "Why did you touch my vintage car without asking?" The words pierced the morning like a knife, jarring me out of the gentle rhythm of my chores. The anger in her tone was immediate, undeniable. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, standing there with the rag still in my hand, the polished leather under my palm now a silent witness to the confrontation. For a brief, surreal moment, the garage felt smaller, the walls closing in, the sunlight no longer a comforting glow but a harsh spotlight on the unfolding drama. Her voice continued, a relentless force, echoing around the empty space as if the garage itself had become a courtroom. "It's my car," she continued, her words sharp, accusatory, dripping with an entitlement I had long come to recognize. "Do you even understand what it means to me? This isn't just a car, it's history, it's family legacy, and you had no right to touch it." Every syllable carried weight, a reminder of her ability to manipulate situations with precision, to turn the ordinary into conflict, to make me doubt myself even in a space I considered my sanctuary. I tried to maintain my composure. "I just wanted to clean it," I said calmly, hoping to defuse the situation with reason. I didn't mean any harm, but reasoning with her was always like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. She was relentless, skilled at twisting situations into confrontations, always finding a way to assert dominance, to make even the smallest actions feel like offenses. I could almost see the imagined scowl on her face, hear the sharp tap of her nails as she gestured wildly, even though she was miles away. Then, almost as if sensing that her initial accusation was not enough, she shifted the conversation, and my heart sank further. "And another thing," she said, her voice dropping into that ominous, knowing tone I had learned to recognize. "I know you've been hiding things from me. Secrets, documents, inheritance papers, perhaps." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze mid-motion, the rag slipping slightly from my grasp. My mother-in-law had always had a way of planting seeds of doubt and suspicion, but this was a direct strike at my integrity, my honesty, and my position within the family. My pulse quickened, and I felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. I glanced around the garage, trying to anchor myself in something tangible, the smell of polish, the shine of a car, the simple orderliness of the tools. But nothing could ground me against the tidal wave of accusations she was unleashing. The morning that had promised calm, peace, and quiet reflection was now shattered, replaced by an invisible battlefield where every word, every action, and every unspoken intention became ammunition. I took a slow, deliberate breath, reminding myself to stay calm. I couldn't allow myself to react impulsively. My mother-in-law thrived on reactions, on watching others lose composure. If I gave her the satisfaction of anger or defensiveness, it would only escalate the situation. Instead, I needed patience, observation, and a careful strategy. But even as I reminded myself of this, a part of me trembled. How had it come to this? How had something as simple and innocent as cleaning a car transformed into a confrontation so explosive, so laden with accusation, and so deeply personal? I thought back to past incidents, trying to find patterns, trying to understand her motives. There had been other small conflicts, of course, the subtle comments during family dinners, the questions about my daughter's upbringing, the insinuations about finances. Each time, she had managed to insert herself into moments that should have been private, to dominate conversations, and to subtly manipulate family perceptions. And now, here she was again, using the car incident as a springboard for a much larger confrontation about trust, respect, and control. The tension in my chest grew heavier, the garage now feeling like a pressure cooker. I could sense the invisible weight of her expectations pressing down, the fear of making a misstep, and the anticipation of her next words. And then, as if guided by some instinct, I realized something crucial. This confrontation was about more than the car. It was about asserting boundaries, protecting my family, and navigating the delicate balance of respect and autonomy within a household dominated by a formidable mother-in-law. I set the rag down carefully, almost ceremoniously, and stepped back from the car. The polished leather gleamed in the morning light, reflecting not just the garage ceiling, but the enormity of the confrontation at hand. Every detail of the car, the chrome, the leather, the history etched into every curve, reminded me that this was more than property. It was a symbol of pride, legacy, and now conflict. Her voice continued over the phone, sharp and insistent, but I had begun to see a path forward. One measured step, one clever move, and I could shift the balance of power in this silent struggle. The car incident, explosive as it seemed, had opened the door to a revelation, a plan, and ultimately, a form of quiet, controlled justice that she could never anticipate. In that charged, almost surreal moment, standing amid the scent of polish and the gleam of chrome, I realized the ordinary day had ended. The real drama had begun. The confrontation over the car was not an isolated incident. It was the tipping point, the spark that would ignite a much larger story of family secrets, subtle revenge, and the strategic assertion of boundaries that had long been overdue. And while she ranted and accused from miles away, completely unaware, I knew that the key to resolving this, and asserting my own dignity, was already in motion, hidden in a single, powerful action that she could never have expected. The car was no longer just a car. It was the center of a storm, a stage for confrontation, and the silent witness to a turning point that would change everything. After the explosive phone call about the vintage car, a lingering unease settled over me like a thick fog. I had thought the morning tension was momentary, a fleeting flare-up that would subside once I finished cleaning the garage. But something deeper, far more insidious, was beginning to emerge. As I stepped back to admire the gleaming car, I noticed a subtle shift in the air around the house, a sense that nothing, not a single corner or drawer, was truly untouched. It was then that the realization hit me, sharp and unwelcome. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about control, surveillance, and intrusion into the most personal corners of my life. My mother-in-law had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Over the past few weeks, I had noticed small, almost imperceptible signs that she had been monitoring more than just family gatherings. Notes left in obscure places, missing envelopes, subtle comments that hinted at knowledge she shouldn't have had. Each incident alone seemed trivial, but when I connected the dots, a chilling pattern emerged. She had been snooping through our home, searching for information, scrutinizing documents, and probing for secrets. My privacy, the sanctuary I had carefully cultivated over years, had been breached, and the feeling of vulnerability was immediate and intense. I began retracing my steps, recalling moments when something had seemed slightly off. There was the time a file folder I kept on the kitchen counter had been moved, or when letters I was certain I had placed in a locked drawer were left open, their contents visible. I remembered the subtle way she would casually inquire about my daughter's room, my husband's documents, even my personal schedules. At the time, I dismissed these incidents as coincidence or as mere curiosity, but now the pieces fit together like a sinister puzzle. The invasion was deliberate, calculated, and deeply unsettling. The thought of her rifling through papers that contained sensitive family information, financial documents, and personal letters made my stomach churn. It wasn't just about curiosity. It was a power play, a silent assertion of dominance over our household, our choices, and the very life we had built together. Every small act of intrusion was a reminder that she was always watching, always assessing, always judging. The house I considered a refuge had become a landscape of surveillance, with invisible eyes in every corner, turning even the most mundane tasks into potential conflicts. I began checking everything meticulously, the drawers, the cabinets, the locked boxes where important papers were kept. Nothing was untouched, and the sense of violation intensified. My mother-in-law had no respect for boundaries. Every private space, every confidential document, had become a field for her investigation. It was as if she believed that entitlement to the family legacy included the right to pry into the private lives of her daughter-in-law and grandchildren. This wasn't curiosity, it was intrusion with a purpose, a silent but persistent attempt to unsettle and control. The invasion of privacy wasn't just about material things, it was psychological warfare. I could feel the tension building in my chest as I considered how carefully she had orchestrated her probing. The way she had insinuated knowledge of the inheritance documents, her strategic timing of accusations, and her ability to make me question my own integrity, it was all part of a deliberate plan. The subtlety of it was maddening. There were no overt threats, no loud confrontations, just the quiet, insidious suggestion that I was being watched, monitored, and assessed. I remembered another instance that now seemed part of the same pattern. A week ago, I had placed a small stack of family letters in a drawer, intending to read them privately after dinner. When I returned, one envelope was slightly creased, its contents partially visible. I had felt a pang of unease, but I had convinced myself it was a mistake, an accident. Now, I realized that it was not an accident at all. Every minor disruption, every misplaced item, every question posed under the guise of concern was a calculated intrusion into my private world. The feeling of betrayal was intense. I had worked hard to create a home where my family felt safe, respected, and free from unnecessary drama. Yet, here was my mother-in-law, exploiting her role in the family to invade our lives, eroding trust with every glance, every comment, every subtle probing into areas that should have been off-limits. It was exhausting, frustrating, and frankly infuriating. The emotional weight of her actions pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to focus, hard to maintain the calm I had cultivated in the garage that morning. I tried to rationalize her behavior, reminding myself that perhaps she was motivated by concern, by love, by a desire to ensure the family's well-being. But even as I repeated those words to myself, they rang hollow. Concern does not involve sneaking into drawers, rifling through documents, or insinuating mistrust with a single-pointed comment. What she was doing was a direct challenge to my autonomy, my authority as a mother-in-law, and my right to privacy. It was an attack that was invisible yet profoundly invasive. The more I thought about it, the more the tension grew. I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, a mix of indignation and determination. I realized that I could not allow this to continue. I needed a plan, a strategy that would assert boundaries without escalating into chaos, a move that would restore dignity and control to our household. But for now, the realization lingered like a shadow. My home, my sanctuary, had been infiltrated, and the violation was deeply personal. I remembered how my daughter had once asked me why Grandma always seemed to know things she shouldn't. At the time, I had shrugged it off, smiling nervously, trying to protect her from adult complications. Now I understood the answer, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on me. I had to protect my family, assert boundaries, and ensure that our home was once again a place of safety, respect, and peace. The invasion of privacy had changed everything. It was no longer a matter of polite avoidance or subtle negotiation. This was a wake-up call, a moment that demanded action, clarity, and courage. Every drawer, every document, every corner of the house had become a silent battlefield, and I could no longer allow my mother-in-law to dictate the rules. Her intrusion was a challenge, and I was determined to meet it, not with overt aggression, but with the quiet, precise, and unstoppable force of strategic intelligence. As I stood in the garage, the morning sun still casting golden light across the polished surfaces, I felt the shift in the atmosphere. The ordinary day was gone. What remained was a house under siege, a family under scrutiny, and a mother-in-law who believed she held the upper hand. But little did she know, her actions had set in motion a chain of events that would soon turn the tables, revealing secrets, asserting boundaries, and reshaping the very dynamics of our family. This invasion of privacy was more than a nuisance, it was a call to action. And I, standing in the quiet garage with the scent of polish still in the air and the gleam of chrome reflecting the rising tension, knew that the first step had already been taken. A single, decisive move, carefully considered and perfectly timed, would not just end the intrusion, it would change everything. The morning's tension had not yet settled. I was still standing in the garage, surrounded by the smell of polish and the gleam of the vintage car, my hands lingering over the smooth leather as if the familiar texture could ground me amidst the growing storm. But the phone call from my mother-in-law earlier had left a lingering unease, a shadow that stretched across the entire house. I knew her well enough to understand that she rarely acted without reason. Her accusations about the car were just the surface, a prelude to something far deeper, more personal, and far more invasive. That's when it hit me. There was a secret, one I had suspected for weeks but had not yet confronted fully, and it was about to come to light. I moved cautiously through the house, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a warning. My daughter's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs, a small island of innocence in an increasingly turbulent sea. But even her carefree tone could not mask the weight of what I was beginning to suspect. Every misplaced envelope, every subtle question from my mother-in-law, every faint, knowing glance she had sent my way over the past months, it all pointed to a single undeniable truth. She had been looking for something specific, something she believed I was hiding, and now, finally, I understood exactly what it was. I entered the study, the room I had always considered my sanctuary. Here, in the quiet corners of the house, the papers and documents that chronicle the family's financial history, inheritance agreements, and private correspondence were kept meticulously organized. I had always been careful, filing everything in precise order, believing that organization could serve as a shield against any misunderstanding or intrusion. But today, as I approached the desk, I noticed something that made my stomach twist into knots. A folder, one I knew had been secure, was slightly askew, the edges bent as though it had been rifled through in haste. My hands trembled as I reached for it, a cold realization creeping over me. My mother-in-law had been here. She had been searching. She had been trying to find what I had carefully hidden from her scrutiny. The folder contained the inheritance documents, papers that held the key to the family's legacy, sensitive information that had been entrusted to me for safekeeping. I had always intended to reveal them at the proper time, with the understanding and agreement of my husband, so as to preserve harmony within the family. But now, it was clear that my mother-in-law had no intention of waiting for that moment. She had been attempting to manipulate the situation, to seize control of information that was not hers to claim, to bend the family's future to her own will. I felt a mix of shock, anger, and a deep, almost aching sadness. The betrayal was palpable. How had it come to this? How had someone so close, someone who should have been invested in the family's well-being, resorted to secretive, invasive tactics to satisfy her own desire for control? The documents themselves seemed heavier than usual, laden not just with paper and ink, but with the weight of trust, responsibility, and the potential for conflict. Each page was a reminder that secrets, even when carefully protected, have a way of drawing attention, especially when they involve money, inheritance, and perceived entitlement. I carefully examined the contents of the folder, tracing the names, dates, and amounts. There were accounts, legal agreements, and instructions left by family members long gone. My mother-in-law's name appeared frequently, but in ways that indicated she had no immediate claim, at least not without the proper processes being followed. The realization struck me like a thunderclap. She had been trying to shortcut the system, to impose her own will upon a carefully constructed legal and familial structure. It was audacious, manipulative, and entirely characteristic of the subtle, quiet power plays I had grown used to over the years. I sat down heavily at the edge of the desk, the folder open in front of me. My mind raced. How much had she uncovered? Had she already pieced together parts of a secret? Or was she still operating in the dark, fumbling for information that I had safeguarded meticulously? I felt the familiar surge of protective instinct for my family, the need to shield my daughter from witnessing this conflict, the desire to prevent my husband from being blindsided by her manipulations, and the burning determination to assert control over a situation that had clearly been hijacked by someone else's ambition. Then, almost unconsciously, I replayed the moments leading up to this discovery. Her phone calls, the casual remarks she had made about the family estate, her thinly veiled questions during dinner about financial matters, all All the subtle probes now made sense. It had been a careful, calculated strategy, sowing seeds of doubt, testing boundaries, and monitoring our responses. Every small action, every whispered comment, was a piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself for weeks, and now the picture was horrifyingly clear. The emotional weight of the discovery pressed down on me. Anger, yes, but also a profound sense of betrayal. This was not merely about papers or money. It was about respect, trust, and the implicit agreements that hold families together. She had breached not just my privacy, but the integrity of our household, and the realization of that fact ignited a fire within me. I would not allow this manipulation to continue unchecked. I carefully closed the folder, as if sealing away both the documents and the anger that threatened to spill over. The house, quiet and still, seemed to amplify the enormity of what had been uncovered. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle from upstairs felt. After uncovering the secret that had been carefully hidden in the depths of the study, I felt a whirlwind of emotions crashing through me like waves against the rocks. Shock, anger, betrayal, and disbelief collided with a deep, simmering sense of indignation. How could someone so close, someone who claimed to care for the family, be capable of such manipulative, invasive behavior? My mother-in-law's actions were not just violations of privacy. They were assaults on trust, dignity, and the very foundations of familial respect. And yet, as intense as the anger burned, there was another, quieter layer of emotion underneath. Sadness. A profound, almost aching sadness that this conflict had become necessary in the first place, that the bonds of family had been strained to this degree. I moved through the house slowly, almost mechanically, each step echoing through the still morning. The air felt heavy, charged with the invisible tension that had been building for weeks, now bursting into the open with the discovery of her intrusion. Every familiar object seemed to take on new significance: the polished car, the neatly arranged tools, the documents carefully filed away, each a testament to my effort to maintain order, control, and peace in the face of subtle but persistent threats. And yet, all of it had been challenged, questioned, and undermined by her quiet, insidious presence. My thoughts shifted to my husband. How would he react when he learned the extent of his mother's manipulation? He had always been gentle, conciliatory, and eager to avoid confrontation, the type of man who preferred compromise over conflict. But the stakes were higher now. This wasn't about petty disagreements over household chores or holiday plans. This was about trust, authority, and the security of our family. I worried about his reaction, not because I feared him, but because I knew the pain he would feel, the conflict between love for his mother and loyalty to his wife, the tension between his desire for peace and the necessity of confronting harsh truths. I also thought about my daughter. Her eyes, wide and innocent, often betrayed her awareness of underlying tensions that adults tried to conceal. How would she interpret these conflicts? How would she navigate the delicate terrain of a grandmother's authority and a mother's protection? The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. I was not merely defending documents or property. I was defending her sense of security, her understanding of family loyalty, and the integrity of the household she had always known as a safe space. Sitting down at the edge of the study desk, I ran my hands over the folder containing the inheritance papers. Each sheet of paper seemed to carry a story, a responsibility, and a subtle tension all its own. And as I stared at the neatly typed words and official signatures, I felt the intensity of the emotional conflict swell. The betrayal was not simply in the act itself. It was in the intent, the premeditated nature of her intrusion. My mother-in-law had been orchestrating this manipulation with a careful, calculating precision, and that knowledge cut deeper than any overt confrontation ever could. I remembered moments from the past few months, the casual remarks, the probing questions, the thinly veiled criticisms. At the time, I had brushed them off, telling myself that they were minor annoyances, that patience and diplomacy would be enough to maintain peace. But now, in the quiet aftermath of discovery, it was painfully clear that patience had limits. Every subtle tactic she had employed, every quiet manipulation, had contributed to this moment of intense emotional turmoil. The careful veneer of civility had been stripped away, revealing the raw, underlying struggle for control and recognition that had always defined our interactions. The anger inside me fluctuated between calm determination and scorching intensity. On one hand, I was resolved to act strategically, to respond with precision and foresight rather than impulsive emotion. On the other hand, the injustice of the situation, her audacity, her invasive actions, and her disregard for boundaries stirred a powerful, almost primal desire for confrontation, for asserting dominance in a way that she could not ignore. These conflicting impulses churned within me, creating a storm of emotional tension that was as exhausting as it was motivating. I thought about how family dynamics often disguise deeper emotional currents. The surface interactions, the polite smiles, the carefully chosen words, all are strategies in an ongoing negotiation of power, loyalty, and identity. In this case, the stakes were exceptionally high. The emotional conflict was not merely about documents or property, it was about respect, trust, and the very definition of family roles. My mother-in-law's behavior challenged the natural order of our household, attempting to impose her will where it did not belong. And I, as both daughter-in-law and protector of the family's integrity, found myself caught in the crossfire, navigating the fine line between confrontation and diplomacy. As I sat there, absorbing the weight of the situation, I also reflected on the broader implications. Emotional conflict in families is rarely about the immediate event. It is about history, patterns of behavior, and the long-standing interplay of personalities. I had witnessed her subtle manipulations for years, but only now, faced with direct evidence, did the full emotional impact crystallize. It was one thing to suspect, another entirely to confirm, and a third to decide how to act. Each phase carried its own emotional intensity, and the responsibility to respond wisely was immense. Tears, surprisingly, welled up in my eyes. Not just from anger or frustration, but from the realization of how delicate the bonds of trust are within a family. Betrayal, even subtle, leaves scars that are invisible yet deeply felt. The documents, the folder, and the intrusion were symbols of a deeper truth, the vulnerability inherent in familial relationships and the constant need to protect what is precious, not through avoidance, but through courage, clarity, and decisive action. The emotional conflict also highlighted an internal battle. I had to reconcile my desire for peace with the need for justice. I had to manage my anger without letting it dictate my actions. I had to protect my family while maintaining dignity and composure. These overlapping demands created a complex emotional landscape, one that was as exhausting as it was motivating. Every thought, every breath, every heartbeat seemed charged with the weight of the decision that awaited me, how to respond to a mother-in-law whose intrusion threatened the very foundation of our family life. And in that quiet, heavy moment, clarity began to emerge. The emotional conflict, while intense and consuming, was also an opportunity, a catalyst for action, for asserting boundaries, and for reclaiming control. I realized that the resolution would not come from anger alone, but from strategic, precise, and decisive action that would protect the family, assert my authority, and restore the delicate balance that had been disrupted. The emotional storm was not a roadblock, it was a signal, a guide, and a prelude to the single, powerful act that would change the course of events entirely. As the morning sun filtered through the study window, illuminating the folder and casting long shadows across the desk, I felt a sense of determination rising within me. The emotional conflict had reached its peak, but it had also clarified my path. There was a way forward, a solution, and a moment of truth approaching. Every fear, every frustration, every pang of betrayal would be channeled into a single, calculated act, one that would finally address the invasion, the manipulation, and the quiet assertion of control that had long defined my mother-in-law's presence in our lives. In that charged, almost electric atmosphere, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the emotional conflict was far from over, but I was ready. Ready to act, ready to reclaim boundaries, and ready to ensure that justice, respect, and dignity would prevail. The storm had been building for years, and now, with the secret uncovered and the stakes higher than ever, the moment of reckoning was imminent. After the emotional storm of discovering my mother-in-law's intrusion and realizing the full scope of the secret she had been desperately trying to uncover, I knew instinctively that I could not face the next steps alone. The battle was not just against her relentless probing or her manipulative tactics. It was a fight for control, dignity, and the security of my family. I needed allies, people I could trust implicitly, who understood the subtle dynamics of family loyalty, betrayal, and the delicate balance of authority within a household. Without guidance, strategy, and support, any move I made could backfire, escalating tensions rather than resolving them. I began by reaching out to my closest confidants. My husband was, of course, my first consideration. We had always shared a partnership built on mutual respect and trust, yet navigating the reality of his mother's manipulations required care. I knew he loved his mother, which meant any confrontation had to be strategic, tempered, and precise. One misstep, one hasty reaction, and he might find himself torn between loyalty to his mother and allegiance to his wife. I carefully explained what I had discovered, keeping my voice calm but firm. I described the way she had rifled through documents, her subtle manipulations, and the emotional weight that her actions carried. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from concern to quiet determination. I could see the gears turning in his mind, recognizing both the injustice and the need for decisive action. Next, I considered friends who had always provided sound advice and a sense of perspective. One confidant in particular, a woman who had witnessed similar family conflicts and possessed a sharp understanding of human behavior, became an invaluable source of guidance. I arranged a private meeting, explaining the entire situation in meticulous detail. She listened intently, occasionally nodding and jotting down notes. Her insights were precise. She pointed out patterns I had noticed but hadn't fully articulated, the way my mother-in-law weaponized her knowledge, the subtle psychological pressure she applied, and the methods she used to destabilize my confidence. Her analysis helped me see the situation not just as a series of isolated incidents, but as a calculated, ongoing campaign. As we strategized, I realized the importance of timing. Any action had to be deliberate, executed with precision, and synchronized with my husband's understanding of the household dynamics. Acting too soon could provoke retaliation. Waiting too long might allow her to discover the next layer of secrets she had been searching for. We discussed contingencies, planned potential scenarios, and even rehearsed responses to her probing questions, making sure that every eventuality was considered. The conversation was intense, stretching late into the evening, and I felt a growing sense of empowerment. For the first time in weeks, I sensed that the initiative was shifting from her hands into mine. I also consulted with my daughter in subtle ways, though carefully shielding her from the full extent of the tension. Children are perceptive, and even indirect exposure to familial conflict can create stress and confusion. Instead, I focused on empowering her within her age-appropriate understanding, encouraging her to express herself, make observations, and understand the importance of boundaries and personal space. This quiet involvement gave me a sense of shared purpose and reminded me why I was fighting, not just to assert authority, but to protect the younger generation from the manipulations and emotional turbulence that could easily destabilize them. While gathering allies, I also turned to legal advice. Though I hoped it would never come to confrontation in courts or formal disputes, understanding my rights, the legal implications of her actions, and the precise boundaries of inheritance and property control was critical. I consulted a family attorney who meticulously explained the ramifications of unauthorized access to sensitive documents and highlighted the specific legal protections in place for both myself and the children. The knowledge was empowering, it added a layer of security, and provided clarity on the limits of what my mother-in-law could claim. This clarity was essential for my strategy. I could now act confidently, knowing the law was firmly on my side. The process of consulting allies was not just strategic, it was deeply emotional. Each conversation, each meeting, reinforced the gravity of the situation while also reminding me of the network of support I had cultivated over the years. These allies were not just helpers, they were witnesses to the subtle injustices I had endured and partners in crafting a response that would assert dignity, protect the family, and ultimately reclaim control. Their guidance strengthened my resolve and illuminated possibilities I had not considered alone. Yet, even as I fortified myself with advice and strategy, a quiet tension lingered. Every detail mattered. The phrasing of a message, the timing of a confrontation, the potential reactions of my mother-in-law and other family members. We mapped out scenarios with painstaking precision. If she confronted me at dinner, if she called unexpectedly, if if she discovered a missing document, how we would respond, and how we could turn the situation to our advantage without escalation. It was meticulous work, a blend of psychological insight, family diplomacy, and tactical planning. In these discussions with my allies, I also began to explore the emotional undercurrents that had long defined our family. Why did my mother-in-law act this way? How had her desire for control shaped interactions over decades? And most importantly, how could I assert my own authority without fracturing family ties? Each reflection deepened my understanding of the stakes, transforming the challenge from a simple conflict into a complex, layered struggle for justice, respect, and emotional equilibrium. The night wore on, but I emerged from these consultations with a sense of clarity I had not felt in weeks. My allies had helped me untangle the web of manipulation, reaffirmed my own judgment, and strengthened my confidence in the plan I was beginning to formulate. Every subtle nuance of her behavior, every potential reaction, every emotional minefield had been considered. I no longer felt like a passive participant in her schemes. I was an active strategist, prepared to reclaim control, protect my family, and ensure that the invasion, betrayal, and manipulation would meet their proper resolution. Finally, after hours of discussion, reflection, and planning, a plan crystallized in my mind. A single, decisive action that would address her intrusion, assert boundaries, and turn the tables in a way she would never anticipate. The allies I had consulted were invaluable, their perspectives allowing me to navigate both the emotional and strategic terrain with precision. The path forward was clear, measured, intelligent, and unstoppable. I could feel a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over me, tempered by the tension that the next steps would inevitably bring. In that charged moment, I understood something profound. Consulting allies had not only prepared me for action but had also reinforced a crucial truth. Family conflicts, especially those involving manipulation and betrayal, are never solved in isolation. Strength comes not just from knowledge and courage, but from the collective wisdom of those who understand the stakes, the dynamics, and the emotional landscape. With the right allies, the right strategy, and the proper timing, even the most entrenched power struggles could be navigated with precision and dignity. And so, as I sat in the quiet of a study, surrounded by notes, plans, and the supportive counsel of trusted allies, I felt the shift begin. The initiative was now mine. The emotional and strategic groundwork had been laid. The secret was protected, the manipulations understood, and the family's integrity safeguarded. All that remained was the decisive move, the single, powerful action that would finally bring clarity, resolution, and justice to the conflict that had dominated our household for too long. The stage was set, the allies were ready, and the moment to act was imminent. As I sat in the quiet of the study, surrounded by the neat piles of inheritance documents and the lingering tension of the recent discoveries, my mind began to drift, inevitably, to the past. The house seemed quieter than usual, the morning light filtering through the curtains in soft, golden beams that illuminated both the furniture and the shadows of memory. Each creak of the floorboards, each familiar scent of the polished wood and old leather, carried with it echoes of years gone by, years in which the subtle dynamics of our family had quietly, persistently shaped the present. Memories surged forward, unbidden, demanding attention, reflection, and emotional reckoning. I remembered my first encounters with my mother-in-law, her carefully measured smiles, her seemingly endless patience, and the aura of authority she carried effortlessly. At the time, I had admired her poise, her ability to command attention and respect without overt force. But even in those early days, I had glimpsed hints of control, subtle expectations woven into her words, and a quiet insistence that her perspective always guided the family's choices. What I hadn't realized then, and what only now became painfully clear, was how those early patterns had grown, how they had evolved into a web of subtle power plays that had shaped interactions in ways I hadn't fully perceived. I thought back to my wedding day, a moment that should have been filled with joy and celebration. My mother-in-law had been present, radiant in her carefully chosen attire, offering what seemed to be advice, encouragement, and warmth. But beneath the surface, I now recognized there had been a quiet scrutiny, an assessment of who I was, how I would fit into the family, and whether I would be worthy of the roles expected of me. Every smile, every handshake, Every casual remark now appeared to have carried a dual purpose, a personal evaluation disguised as maternal interest. That day, my husband had stood beside me, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of judgment and expectation that had shaped every interaction. As the years passed, these subtle dynamics became more pronounced. Family gatherings, holidays, and even ordinary dinners were arenas in which unspoken rules, subtle cues, and emotional negotiations played out. I recalled instances where she had questioned my decisions in ways that seemed innocuous on the surface but carried deeper implications. The choice of paint color for the kitchen, the arrangement of furniture, the timing of family celebrations. Each moment was a small test, a probe to see whether I would conform, resist, or falter under scrutiny. At the time, I had dismissed these incidents as typical in-law involvement. Now, with the discovery of her intrusion into our private documents, I saw the same patterns with chilling clarity. One particularly vivid memory returned, almost like a photograph in my mind. A quiet afternoon when my mother-in-law had visited unannounced, ostensibly to check on her grandchildren. She had wandered through the house, commenting on small details, asking about schedules, subtly probing for information. I had smiled, answered politely, and maintained the facade of normalcy, unaware that she was quietly gathering information, mapping the household's inner workings, and quietly assessing where control could be exerted. That afternoon, a seemingly mundane visit now revealed itself as part of a meticulous pattern of observation, a prelude to the intrusion I had recently uncovered. I also thought of conversations overheard, snippets of dialogue that had seemed trivial but now carried deeper significance. Her words, often carefully crafted and delivered with casual precision, had subtly insinuated knowledge, tested boundaries, and sowed seeds of doubt. I remembered one evening, long before the recent conflicts, when she had remarked, "It's important to know what's really happening in a family. Secrets can be dangerous." At the time, I had smiled politely, dismissing it as philosophical musings. Now, the words struck like an omen, a quiet warning of the lengths she would go to uncover what she believed was hidden from her. Memories of earlier family conflicts also resurfaced, moments in which her influence had shaped outcomes, decisions, and relationships. I recall the funeral of her own mother, an event that had revealed the depths of her strategic thinking and ability to subtly guide family actions. Even in grief, she had wielded influence with quiet precision, deciding seating arrangements, directing conversations, and ensuring that her interpretation of family priorities prevailed. Those moments, once viewed as markers of her organizational skill or concern, now took on a different hue, calculated exercises in asserting authority and positioning herself as the arbiter of family knowledge and control. As I reflected further, the emotional weight of these memories intertwined with the present. I could feel the continuum of tension, manipulation, and subtle control stretching from past to present, culminating in the recent discovery of the inheritance documents. Each act of intrusion, each probing question, and each carefully measured comment formed a tapestry of influence that had long shaped our family dynamic. Understanding this history clarified not only her motivations, but also the patterns of interaction that had allowed her subtle authority to persist. The past was not distant. It was alive in every glance, every interaction, and every decision she made, quietly shaping the present with invisible hands. I also remembered moments of kindness, genuine affection, and rare expressions of warmth from my mother-in-law. Those memories complicated the emotional landscape, reminding me that family relationships are never simply black and white. There had been moments of connection, laughter shared over dinners, gentle reassurances when I struggled, and celebrations in which we were united. These recollections highlighted the complexity of the emotional conflict. The same person capable of care and tenderness could also be a source of intrusion, manipulation, and subtle power struggles. It was this duality that made the situation so delicate and the eventual response so critical. As I traced these memories in my mind, I realized that they had prepared me, in an indirect and profound way, for the decisive action I was about to take. Understanding the patterns, recognizing the subtle manipulations, and acknowledging the emotional complexities provided me with a framework to respond strategically. The past had not merely informed the present, it had armed me with insight, clarity, and the emotional resilience needed to confront the intrusion, assert boundaries, and reclaim authority in a way that was thoughtful, precise, and undeniably effective. In that quiet study, enveloped by the sunlight and the shadows of memory, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The recollections of past interactions, both subtle and significant, had crystallized into understanding. I could now see clearly the motives behind every probing question, every carefully timed remark, and every subtle act of control. And within this clarity emerged a singular focus, the need to act decisively, to assert my authority, and to protect the family and its secrets with a strategic, intelligent response that would leave no room for further intrusion. The memories of the past had illuminated the present. They had revealed the patterns, motives, and emotional currents that had long shaped our family interactions. And as I prepared to take the next step, I understood that the power of memory, reflection, and insight would guide me. The stage was set, the emotional foundation established, and the strategy clear. All that remained was to channel the lessons of the past into action, to ensure that the next move, the decisive move, would not only protect the family but also restore balance, dignity, and respect. The past had spoken, and I was ready to answer. After hours of reflecting on the memories of the past and consulting with allies, I knew that action was inevitable, but it had to be precise, calculated, and silent. There would be no room for impulsive reactions, no space for loud confrontations, no opportunity for emotional displays that could give away my strategy. The stakes were too high, the family too vulnerable, and the manipulation of my mother-in-law too cunning to allow any misstep. This was no longer merely about documents, inheritance, or control. It was about asserting boundaries, reclaiming authority, and protecting the integrity of our household in a way that could not be challenged or undermined. I began by mapping out the parameters of my plan. Every action needed to be deliberate. Every potential response from my mother-in-law had to be anticipated. I created mental scenarios for every possible confrontation. If she called unexpectedly, how I would respond calmly. If she questioned my actions in person, how I would maintain composure while asserting my boundaries. If she tried to manipulate other family members, how I would subtly redirect their attention without escalating conflict. Each scenario required careful thought, a precise balance of firmness and subtlety, and an unwavering focus on the ultimate goal, restoring control without igniting open hostility. The study became my command center. I spread the inheritance documents in organized stacks, reviewing every clause, signature, and date. The papers that once had seemed merely functional now felt like tools of strategy, each representing leverage, authority, and security. I traced the sequence of events in my mind, the discovery of her intrusion, the subtle manipulations I had observed over the years, the conversations with allies, and the lessons gleaned from past interactions. Each piece of information added a layer to the plan, a layer of insight that would allow me to anticipate her moves and counter them effectively. I also considered the emotional battlefield. My mother-in-law's strength lay not only in her knowledge, but in her ability to provoke uncertainty and self-doubt. She thrived on emotional pressure, exploiting hesitation and fear to manipulate outcomes. I had to neutralize this advantage, cultivating patience, calmness, and confidence in my own authority. To do this, I rehearsed responses in my mind, phrases that were firm yet non-confrontational, tones that conveyed confidence without aggression, and body language that projected quiet but undeniable control. The planning was meticulous, like preparing for a chess match where every piece, every move, and every potential counterplay had to be considered in advance. During these hours of preparation, I also revisited the subtle signals that had indicated her manipulations over time. The seemingly casual remarks about family finances, the probing questions about schedules and responsibilities, the faintly judgmental glances during family gatherings, all had been part of a pattern that now informed my strategy. I documented these observations mentally, categorizing them according to potential impact, emotional leverage, and predictability. This inventory became the foundation of a silent plan, ensuring that no detail, no matter how minor, would be overlooked. I reached out to my closest allies one more time, not for advice, but for validation and subtle coordination. I reviewed the sequence of events I anticipated, the timing of potential communications, and the framework of responses to any confrontation. Every ally understood the importance of discretion. No hints, no leaks, no premature disclosures. The plan depended on complete silence and strategic precision. Even a single word spoken at the wrong moment could unravel the carefully constructed path to resolution. As I continued planning, I also examined my own emotional readiness. Silent planning was not just tactical, it was psychological. I had to be prepared to remain calm under pressure, to maintain clarity when provoked, and to resist the temptation to react impulsively. I practiced breathing techniques, visualized potential confrontations, and rehearsed responses until they felt instinctual. The mental preparation was as crucial as the tactical one, because the moment of action would demand both emotional control and intellectual precision. The house itself became a silent witness to my preparations. Each room, each object, each quiet corner seemed charged with anticipation. Even ordinary household sounds, the creak of a door, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, felt heightened, as if echoing the intensity of the silent planning taking place. The ordinary environment contrasted sharply with the extraordinary mental and emotional work unfolding within me, amplifying the tension and focus. I also considered timing with precision. The effectiveness of the plan depended not just on action, but on when and how the action would be executed. I evaluated my mother-in-law's habits, routines, and likely responses, identifying the optimal moment to act. It had to be a time when her attention was focused elsewhere, when she could not anticipate or counter the move, and when the impact would be maximum with minimal risk of immediate retaliation. This temporal calculation was critical. It transformed a simple action into a strategic strike that could decisively shift control back into my hands. While the planning was thorough and strategic, it was also suffused with emotional stakes. The silent preparation was not merely about tactics, it was about reclaiming dignity, asserting authority, and ensuring that the subtle injustices of the past would not continue unchecked. Each mental rehearsal, every mapped-out scenario, reinforced my confidence, tempered my anger, and focused my resolve. I was not preparing to punish or humiliate. I was preparing to restore balance, protect my family, and ensure that the household operated on principles of respect and fairness. As night descended and the house settled into a deeper quiet, the plan solidified in my mind. I could see the sequence clearly, anticipate her move, maintain composure, leverage the information I had protected, and execute the action with precision. Everything had been considered, the emotional, the tactical, the psychological, and the temporal. The silent planning had transformed uncertainty into confidence, chaos into clarity, and tension into purpose. In that profound stillness, I realized that the silent planning was itself empowering. By taking the time to reflect, strategize, and prepare, I had reclaimed agency over the situation. I was no longer at the mercy of my mother-in-law's manipulations. I was in control. The emotional intensity that had once threatened to overwhelm me was now channeled into purpose, focus, and resolve. The stage was set, the strategy clear, and the moment of action approaching with inexorable precision. Everything rested on the next move, the single, decisive action that would not only confront the intrusion, assert boundaries, and reclaim authority, but also deliver the subtle, unmistakable message that the family's integrity would no longer be challenged. The silent planning had been exhaustive, intricate, and emotionally charged, and now it converged toward a singular, transformative moment. Every observation, every reflection, every consultation, every rehearsal had led to this point. And as I sat in the quiet study, the weight of preparation settling over me like a protective cloak, I understood this truth with absolute clarity. The time for silent planning was ending. The time for decisive action was imminent. The next step would change everything. After days of meticulous preparation, consultation with allies, and silent strategic planning, I found myself in the most challenging phase, the waiting. Waiting was deceptively passive, but it was a battle in its own right, a battle of patience, control, and anticipation. Every minute felt stretched, heavy with potential consequences. The house, usually so familiar and comforting, seemed almost foreign, imbued with tension, shadowed in anticipation, and punctuated by the quiet ticking of the clock. Time had become both an enemy and an ally. Every second that passed carried the weight of strategy, every movement in the house a possible sign of her intrusion or awareness, every sound a reminder that the next moment could bring confrontation. I occupied myself with seemingly mundane tasks, organizing the kitchen, tending to laundry, and arranging documents, but each action was infused with subtle vigilance. My hands might be folding a sheet or placing a box in order, but my mind was elsewhere, analyzing, anticipating, and rehearsing. I imagined the potential reactions of my mother-in-law to the decisive move I planned to make. Would she explode with anger, attempt manipulation, or try to convince other family members against me? Every scenario was considered, every possible ripple in the household calculated, and every contingency anticipated. The waiting was not inactivity, it was a tense, silent preparation for impact. Even as I engaged in routine chores, my senses were heightened. I noticed the faintest creak of floorboards, the subtle hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of curtains in the breeze. Each sound became a clue, a signal that could indicate her movement, her curiosity, or her approach. My heartbeat seemed louder than normal, my breath shallower, as if the entire house had become a living, responsive entity attuned to the quiet storm of anticipation brewing within me. Each footstep, each whisper of wind, each distant sound was scrutinized, measured, and interpreted. The waiting also brought its own emotional turbulence. I oscillated between calm determination and surging anxiety, a pendulum swinging between rational clarity and emotional tension. The discovery of her intrusion and the planning that followed had been mentally exhausting. The waiting, however, was emotionally taxing in ways that strategy alone could not address. I reminded myself of the stakes, the family's integrity, the protection of our home, the preservation of trust, and the assertion of boundaries. These reminders grounded me, keeping the emotional turbulence from tipping into panic or impulsive action. In these hours of anticipation, I also reflected on the patterns of her behavior. My mother-in-law was meticulous, calculating, and persistent. She would rarely act hastily. She would probe carefully, seek information subtly, and exert pressure in ways that seemed casual but were actually deliberate. Waiting for the right moment, therefore, required a deep understanding of her psychology, anticipating patience with patience, planning subtlety with subtlety, and countering calculation with strategy. This mental game was exhausting, but it was necessary. It was a chess match of wills, with the entire household as the board. I also considered the impact on my husband and daughter. They were aware of the tension, sensitive to the subtleties, and yet largely shielded from the full scope of the planning. I had to maintain an environment of calm and stability while internally navigating the storm of anticipation. Conversations were measured, interactions gentle, and presence consistent. Any misstep could reveal my intentions prematurely, undermining the plan and risking escalation. The waiting was therefore not only strategic, it was protective, ensuring that my family remained grounded, secure, and untroubled by the brewing confrontation. During this period, I found myself revisiting every interaction, every memory, and every nuance of the family dynamic. I replayed past conversations with my mother-in-law, noting the patterns of her language, her gestures, and the subtle emotional triggers she employed. Each memory became a tool, a guide, a blueprint for anticipating her reactions and ensuring that the decisive move would be effective. This reflective process was intensive, mentally draining, and emotionally charged, but it provided clarity. The moment had to be chosen with surgical precision. Any deviation from the plan could jeopardize the intended outcome. The waiting was further intensified by the unpredictable nature of her behavior. Although patterns existed, human behavior could never be fully anticipated. I rehearsed responses, visualized confrontations, and considered both expected and unexpected reactions. Would she confront me directly, attempt to manipulate other family members, or retreat temporarily, plotting her next maneuver? Each possibility required a mental strategy, a pre-planned response, and the discipline to maintain composure under emotional duress. The psychological tension was immense. The stakes were as high as they had ever been in our shared history. I found solace in small rituals, a cup of tea, a quiet walk through the garden, and mindful breathing exercises. These moments of calm allowed me to stabilize my emotions, focus my thoughts, and maintain readiness. Yet even in these moments of relative peace, the tension never fully dissipated. I was acutely aware of the looming decision, the single, decisive action that could redefine the family dynamic, assert boundaries, and address the long-standing manipulations. The waiting was an active engagement with strategy, a continuous mental preparation, and a test of patience unlike any I had faced before. Throughout this time, my mind also revisited the alliances I had forged, my husband, friends, and legal advisors. Each ally represented both support and a silent witness to the unfolding tension. I consider the guidance they had provided, the scenarios we had rehearsed, and the strategic insights that had shaped the plan. Their counsel had given me confidence, but the execution rested solely on timing and discretion. The waiting, therefore, was as much about honoring the intelligence and support of my allies as it was about preparing myself psychologically and emotionally. Even my internal dialogue became a tool during this waiting period. I reminded myself of past victories and small conflicts, of moments where calm and strategic thinking had prevailed over impulsive emotion. I visualized the desired outcome, imagining the quiet satisfaction of finally reclaiming control, asserting boundaries, and sending a clear, unambiguous message that the household would no longer tolerate manipulation. These mental rehearsals reinforced focus, patience, and discipline, transforming anxiety into anticipation and tension into purpose. As the hours stretched into late morning, and the sunlight shifted across the room, I sensed the culmination approaching. Every observation, every preparation, every reflective memory had built toward this precise point in time. The air felt charged, the environment heightened, and the household suspended in a delicate balance between normalcy and the imminent confrontation. The waiting, though silent and passive in appearance, had become a crucible of strategy, emotion, and foresight. I could feel the moment nearing, the exact point when all the planning, all the reflection, and all the consultations would converge. The timing had to be perfect, the action deliberate, and the response precise. One misstep could undo weeks of preparation. Yet, paradoxically, the tension of waiting also instilled a deep sense of power. I was no longer reactive. I was poised, ready, and in control. The waiting was not mere patience. It was the final, essential act in a meticulously orchestrated strategy. And in that suspended, almost sacred space, I understood one truth with absolute clarity. The moment had to be seized with precision, courage, and clarity. The waiting was over. The decisive action, the text that would change everything, was about to unfold, and with it, the balance of power, respect, and authority in the family would be irrevocably transformed. After days of silent preparation, reflection, and patient waiting, the moment I had been meticulously planning for finally began to take shape. It came not with fanfare or obvious signs, but subtly, quietly, like a ripple across the otherwise calm surface of our household. The house seemed to breathe around me, carrying the residual tension of my mother-in-law's previous intrusions and the meticulous planning I had undertaken. Every sound, the faint ticking of the clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, the soft rustle of curtains in the morning breeze, felt amplified, a signal that the alignment of circumstances I had been waiting for was finally occurring. The opportunity was perfect, and I instinctively knew it. It began when my husband left for a late morning meeting, leaving the house temporarily quiet. My daughter was occupied with her art project at the dining table, and even the cat seemed to sense the tension, moving cautiously across the living room floor. My mother-in-law, unaware that her routine had been anticipated, entered the house as she often did, ostensibly for a casual visit, her presence a seemingly benign intrusion that carried with it the potential for manipulation and scrutiny. She greeted me with a deceptively warm smile, the kind that had always masked subtle judgment and calculated curiosity. At that moment, I recognized the convergence of timing, environment, and opportunity that I had envisioned during days of patient planning. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting sharp lines of light across the countertops and illuminating the stacks of documents I had reviewed repeatedly over the past week. I had positioned myself carefully, sitting at the table with my phone in hand, the single decisive message drafted, polished, and rehearsed mentally countless times. The environment was intentionally orchestrated to ensure maximum impact. Every detail mattered. The angle of sunlight that illuminated the room, the apparent casualness of my posture, the calmness in my expression, and the deliberate placement of documents that subtly reinforced my authority. Even the subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee seemed to carry the weight of anticipation. As she approached, the air thickened with the tension of unspoken expectations and the weight of past interactions. Her eyes scanned the room, momentarily noting the arrangement of papers and the calm yet deliberate composure I projected. She paused, perhaps sensing something different, some unspoken shift in control, though she could not identify it. Her voice, sweet yet slightly calculating, broke the silence. "I just wanted to see how everything is going, and maybe check on those documents you've been keeping from me." The words were casually delivered, yet underneath lay the same probing, intrusive intent that had fueled my silent planning. This was the opportunity one had been waiting for, the precise alignment of timing, presence, and expectation. I recognized the moment immediately. The combination of her unguarded approach, my prepared position, and the knowledge that the house was momentarily free of other distractions created a window in which the decisive action could be executed flawlessly. I felt the surge of confidence that had been building over days of planning and reflection, tempered by patience and anticipation. The power of the moment was intoxicating, a culmination of strategy, emotional intelligence, and silent preparation. I recalled all the subtle cues and behaviors I had catalogued over the years, the slight tilt of her head when she sought information, the measured tone she adopted when probing, the carefully crafted pauses designed to provoke anxiety or hesitation. Each of these patterns informed my response strategy. I knew exactly how to act, exactly when to move, and exactly what the effect of a single text message would be. The past had prepared me, the allies had guided me, and the silent planning had aligned me perfectly with the present opportunity. The room seemed to contract around us, every shadow, every sound, every minor movement magnified in significance. My heart rate increased slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of decisive action, the thrill of finally stepping into the role of authority and control I had been cultivating. I imagined the impact of the message on her: surprise, perhaps anger, the immediate recognition that her covert efforts had been anticipated and neutralized. The thought was satisfying, but I remained composed, knowing that emotional reactions could undermine the precision of the moment. My mother-in-law continued to scan the room, her gaze falling briefly on my phone as I held it casually, ensuring she perceived nothing but ordinary calmness. I rehearsed the exact wording of the message in my mind one final time, visualizing the effect it would have, not just on her but on the family dynamic. The plan was designed to assert boundaries, reclaim authority, and subtly, but undeniably, establish control over the household, all with the power of a single, carefully crafted text. The elegance of simplicity was at the core of the strategy: minimal effort, maximum impact, and the perfect alignment of timing and opportunity. As she moved closer, I felt the tension crystallize, each heartbeat synchronized with the unfolding moment. Every instinct, every observation, every subtle preparation led to this singular point. The opportunity was not merely favorable, it was flawless. The house, the time of day, the temporary absence of other family members, the alignment of her curiosity with my readiness, all converged into a moment that had been carefully orchestrated for days. The sense of anticipation was electric, almost tangible, as if the walls themselves recognized the significance of the action about to unfold. I recall the days spent waiting, consulting allies, revisiting memories, and rehearsing silently. Each effort had been a thread woven into a precise tapestry, culminating in this alignment. The perfect opportunity was not accidental. It was the product of strategy, insight, patience, and understanding the patterns of human behavior. My mother-in-law, blissfully unaware of the orchestration behind her presence, had unknowingly walked into the precise conditions required for the plan to succeed flawlessly. Even as the moment approached, I maintained an appearance of casual composure. My posture was relaxed, my gaze seemingly unremarkable, my actions ordinary in appearance. Yet beneath this calm exterior, every neuron, every thought, every intention was directed toward the execution of the decisive action. The alignment of opportunity, preparation, and timing was complete, and the culmination of days of meticulous effort was at hand. I felt a mixture of calmness and exhilaration, a deep, steady confidence infused. with the thrill of impending resolution. The perfect opportunity had emerged not by chance, but as the result of deliberate, disciplined, and strategic preparation. All the silent planning, all the reflections on past behavior, all the consultations with trusted allies, all the understanding of emotional and psychological patterns had led to this singular moment. The stage was set, the alignment complete, and the decisive action, the text that would change everything, was ready to be delivered. As she paused near the documents, glancing inquisitively, I recognized the precise instant. The moment had arrived. The perfect opportunity was finally mine. The culmination of strategy, patience, and emotional intelligence was within reach, and the balance of power, control, and family dynamics would be forever altered by the act I was about to perform. The tension in the room was palpable, almost suffocating, yet controlled. Every heartbeat echoed the significance of what was about to occur. The decisive text, the one I had spent days preparing for, analyzing and perfecting, would finally be sent. And in that instant, the household, the family dynamic, and my relationship with my mother-in-law would shift irrevocably. The perfect opportunity had arrived. The moment had arrived. After days of silent planning, reflection, observation, and patient anticipation, I held my phone in my hand, feeling the weight of every decision I had made, every strategy one had meticulously crafted, and every memory that had led to this instant. The room was quiet, yet thick with tension, as if the very air understood the significance of what was about to occur. My mother-in-law moved around the kitchen with her usual subtle authority, scanning the room, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the documents, unaware that the final stroke of strategy was already poised to strike. I could see the faint glint of her curiosity and calculated intent, a curiosity that had been my constant challenge for years, now unknowingly aligned perfectly with my plan. I paused for a fraction of a second, my fingers hovering above the screen, feeling the immense pressure of the moment. Every heartbeat echoed in my chest, but it was not fear, it was anticipation, clarity, and focus. This single text would do more than deliver words. It would convey authority, set boundaries, and assert control in a way that had never been achieved before. The words had been chosen carefully, refined through countless mental rehearsals, and polished for maximum impact. They were designed to be concise, undeniable, and inescapably effective, a single strike that would leave no room for argument, manipulation, or further intrusion. I remembered the countless hours of observing her patterns, noting the subtleties of her behavior, and anticipating her reactions. The text had to be more than clever. It had to resonate with her deepest expectations and assumptions while simultaneously flipping the dynamic of power entirely. I envisioned the internal calculations she would make upon reading the message, the initial shock, the subtle anger, and ultimately the recognition that her attempts to dominate, to manipulate, and to intrude had been anticipated and neutralized. It was a plan that relied not on confrontation, not on anger, and not on public displays, but on precision, intelligence, and strategic clarity. Finally, my thumb pressed the send button. The vibration of the phone in my hand felt like the sound of an unseen bell, signaling the culmination of strategy, patience, and emotional intelligence. The message went out, carrying with it all the weight of planning and insight, a perfectly calibrated combination of clarity, authority, and subtle confrontation. I watched my mother-in-law, pretending to casually rearrange some papers, completely unaware that the ground beneath her control had just shifted. Seconds passed, yet the effect of the message began immediately. Her face, initially composed, registered a subtle change. I noticed the fleeting hesitation in her movements, the slight pause in her breath, and the instant recalibration of her gaze. The room, once quiet and seemingly ordinary, now vibrated with the invisible tension of altered dynamics. She had not expected such a precise, controlled, and effective response. My single, deliberate text had bypassed her defenses, anticipated her manipulations, and delivered a clear, undeniable statement of authority. The content of the message was simple, yet powerful. It referenced her intrusion, reaffirmed my authority, and subtly warned that further interference would be met with boundaries she could not circumvent. It was precise, calculated, and delivered without emotion, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of consequences. I had spent days rehearsing the tone, the phrasing, and the impact, ensuring that it would provoke immediate recognition, emotional recalibration, and a clear understanding of limits. And now, as it sat on her phone, the effect was undeniable. I observed her closely, noting the microexpressions that betrayed her surprise, indignation, and initial resistance. Yet, within moments, the realization began to settle in. Her covert manipulations, her probing questions, and her subtle power plays had all been anticipated. The text had not merely responded, it had preemptively neutralized, asserting control without aggression and setting boundaries without confrontation. The house, once a stage for subtle manipulation, now became a space where my authority was clear, quiet, and unassailable. Emotionally, the impact was immediate for me as well. I felt a surge of relief, satisfaction, and empowerment. The tension that had built over years of subtle control, probing, and emotional manipulation began to dissipate. The careful orchestration of strategy, reflection, and planning had reached its apex. The silent preparation, the patient waiting, and the anticipation of opportunity had culminated in a single, powerful act. I realized that the text was not merely a message, it was the embodiment of control, intelligence, and the assertion of boundaries that had long been necessary. I could see the subtle recalibration of her behavior, the immediate reconsideration of her next moves, and the faint acknowledgement that she had been outmaneuvered. Her usual composure was momentarily disrupted. Her habitual control of the room paused as she processed the implications. I sensed the internal struggle, the rapid calculation of potential responses, the realization that her patterns had been anticipated, and the dawning awareness that her attempts to dominate were no longer viable. The text had done more than deliver words. It had reshaped the emotional and psychological landscape of the household. The timing could not have been more perfect. The absence of my husband, the engagement of my daughter in her activities, and the quiet stillness of the house created a focused environment in which the effect of the message was maximized. There were no distractions, no external influences, no interference. The full impact of the text unfolded privately, internally, yet with immediate psychological consequences. My mother-in-law's presence, usually commanding, now became a mirror reflecting her own astonishment and recognition of the boundaries she could no longer cross. The room, though physically unchanged, felt altered. Every object, every sound, every shadow seemed infused with the new dynamics I had established. The documents that had once been merely papers now represented authority and control, subtly reinforced by the strategic positioning during the delivery of the text. My mother-in-law, once the subtle orchestrator of family dynamics, now moved with caution, awareness, and the faint, undeniable understanding that her influence had been checked. In that moment, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes not from conflict, but from the mastery of strategy, insight, and emotional intelligence. The years of subtle manipulations, probing questions, and quiet challenges had been met not with confrontation, but with precise, deliberate action. The text was simple, yet it carried the cumulative weight of observation, preparation, patience, and understanding. It had delivered justice silently, effectively, and irrevocably. Even as I watched her absorb the implications, I remained calm, composed, and deliberate. There was no triumphalism, no overt celebration, only the quiet awareness that the balance of power, respect, and boundaries had shifted. The effect of a single, well-crafted, perfectly timed text had achieved what words alone could not: clarity, authority, and control. The house, the family, and the dynamics that had long been dominated by subtle manipulation were now realigned. As the seconds ticked by, the full impact settled in for both of us. She now understood, without argument or confrontation, the limits she could not cross, the boundaries she could not challenge, and the consequences she had never anticipated. The text had changed everything. Not just the documents, not just the immediate household dynamic, but the unspoken hierarchy, the subtle authority, and the psychological landscape that had long governed our interactions. It was a transformation both quiet and absolute, a single message that had rewritten the rules, redefined respect, and restored balance. And in that moment, as the house returned to its measured quiet, I realized the truth. Years of subtle struggle, careful observation, patient planning, and disciplined waiting had converged into a single, decisive act. One text, one moment, one irreversible shift. My mother-in-law had been outmaneuvered, boundaries had been established, and the family dynamics were forever changed. The text had done what all the conversations, confrontations, and silent frustrations could not. It had changed everything. The moment my mother-in-law read the text, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly, yet with unmistakable intensity. At first, her eyes flickered with confusion, a hesitation that betrayed the sudden disruption in the patterns she had long relied upon. The poised composure she had perfected over decades of subtle manipulation faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, I could sense the profound impact of what had just occurred. It was as if a carefully constructed facade had momentarily cracked, revealing a mixture of disbelief, shock, and the faintest trace of vulnerability, emotions I had scarcely ever witnessed in her presence before. She lowered her gaze to the phone, rereading the message, each word now magnified in its significance. The text was simple, concise, yet it carried a weight that words alone rarely possessed. It conveyed boundaries she had tried to circumvent for years, authority she had attempted to undermine, and control she had subtly exercised over household dynamics, all neutralized with a calm, deliberate precision. The subtle power she had wielded effortlessly was disrupted. Her strategic advantage had been removed in a single, definitive moment. My heart raced slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that my careful planning, patience, and strategic patience had produced exactly the effect I had envisioned. Her fingers hovered momentarily over the phone screen, trembling slightly, as if weighing her next move. The hesitation was palpable. I could see the gears turning in her mind, trying to reconcile what she had anticipated, another subtle negotiation, another attempt at quiet control, with the reality of the decisive action that had just been delivered. Her brows furrowed slightly, and a faint flush crept over her cheeks. These small, seemingly minor details revealed a monumental shift. She was unprepared for the precision of the response, unarmed against the subtle authority I had asserted, and suddenly confronted with the undeniable fact that her influence in the household had been checked. I observed her posture, which had always carried a subtle dominance, now subtly altered. She leaned back slightly, adjusting the stance she used to assert psychological control. Her hands, previously poised and composed, shifted with a barely perceptible tension. The eyes, which often scanned the room with quiet calculation, now darted briefly as she absorbed the implications of the message. Her lips pursed momentarily, an unconscious attempt to regain composure, to assert control, and to mask the internal recalibration occurring in her mind. Yet, beneath the surface, it was evident. The text had disrupted the habitual dynamics she relied upon to subtly dominate and manipulate. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, every movement, every shadow became magnified in significance. The distant hum of traffic outside, the subtle creak of the wooden floorboards, even the soft rustle of the curtains in the morning breeze, all seemed to resonate with the intensity of the moment. It was as if the house itself acknowledged the seismic shift in authority that had just occurred. My mother-in-law, usually the orchestrator of subtle influence, was now the subject of its recalibration. I could see the emotional roller coaster within her. First came shock, an initial disbelief that such a simple message could carry such undeniable authority. This quickly transitioned into indignation, a flicker of the familiar anger she had used over the years to unsettle, provoke, and dominate. Yet, beneath that anger, I could detect a subtle acknowledgement, a silent recognition that her attempts to manipulate or intrude further would be futile. She was confronted not with confrontation, but with the quiet, irrevocable assertion of boundaries. The psychological impact was immediate, profound, and in many ways irreversible. Her reaction extended beyond the immediate emotional response. I noticed subtle behavioral shifts almost instantly. She stopped pacing as she usually did when attempting to dominate a conversation, paused mid-gesture when reaching for documents, and even adjusted her tone when speaking to me, carefully measuring each word against the authority now quietly but unmistakably established. It was as if the entire fabric of our interactions had been recalibrated in the span of moments, demonstrating the precision of my strategy. Emotionally, I experienced a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and quiet triumph. The tension that had been building over weeks, even months, of subtle intrusions, manipulations, and covert observations had been met with clarity, authority, and effectiveness. The reaction I observed was the tangible manifestation of careful planning, patient waiting, and strategic execution. Every detail of her response, every hesitation, every glance, every microexpression was a testament to the success of a carefully orchestrated plan. I also observed the subtle psychological ripple across the household dynamic. My daughter, quietly absorbed in her art project, looked up briefly, sensing a shift in the tone of the room, though unaware of the specifics. My mother-in-law's recalibrated demeanor sent a signal through the room, a silent acknowledgement that authority had shifted, boundaries had been enforced, and manipulation would no longer succeed. Even the objects in the room, the documents, the furniture, the layout itself, seemed to take on new significance, now framed within the context of this immediate reaction and its consequences. Her initial attempts at recovery were subtle, almost imperceptible. A carefully constructed smile, a measured tone of voice, a tentative approach to conversation, all reflected an effort to regain some semblance of control. Yet, beneath the surface, I could see the cognitive recalibration. Her habitual strategies, previously reliable, were suddenly ineffective. The balance of power had shifted, and the immediate reaction she experienced was the first indication that her influence over household dynamics would no longer be taken for granted. I remained calm, composed, and deliberate. I allowed her to process the impact fully, refraining from any additional comments or gestures that might dilute the effect. My posture, my expression, my quiet demeanor all reinforced the assertion of control, amplifying the psychological impact of the text. This was not about confrontation. It was about authority, clarity, and the unspoken understanding that the dynamics of influence had irrevocably shifted. The immediate reaction was both gratifying and instructive. It demonstrated that the careful combination of observation, preparation, timing, and emotional intelligence could achieve what years of subtle tension, passive resistance, and indirect challenges had not. My mother-in-law's response was the tangible proof of the plan's effectiveness, a mix of surprise, recalibration, and silent acknowledgement that the rules had changed. For a brief moment, the room held a suspended intensity. Every glance, every movement, every breath carried the weight of this new reality. My mother-in-law's internal negotiation between pride, habit, and the undeniable clarity of boundaries played out subtly yet unmistakably in her posture, gestures, and tone. The immediate reaction was complete. The text had done its work, establishing authority, asserting control, and redefining the household dynamic with precision and psychological impact. And in that profound instant, I understood the power of preparation, strategy, and patience. The careful orchestration of days, the anticipation of opportunity, and the precise execution of a single, deliberate action had yielded the immediate reaction I had envisioned. The balance of power had shifted, the boundaries had been enforced, and the subtle manipulations of years had been neutralized. In the stillness that followed, I recognized one irrefutable truth. The text had not merely been sent, it had irrevocably changed everything. The immediate reaction of my mother-in-law to the text was just the beginning. What followed were ripples that spread through the household, subtly yet profoundly reshaping family dynamics. The room, once thick with unspoken tension, now seemed to carry a quiet recalibration, a sense of newly established boundaries that no one could ignore. Every glance, every gesture, and every conversation became layered with the awareness that the rules had changed. The house, which had long been a stage for subtle manipulations, covert observations, and quiet disputes, now operated under an invisible yet unmistakable shift in authority, one that had been quietly cemented by a single decisive action. My husband, returning from his meeting, was the first to sense the difference. Entering the house, he immediately noticed the subtle changes in the atmosphere. My mother-in-law, usually poised and dominating in her presence, now moved with a calculated restraint, her actions tempered by the invisible boundaries the text had established. The subtle power plays she typically executed with precision were momentarily absent, replaced by a measured caution that seemed almost forced. My husband's eyes met mine, a silent exchange of recognition passing between us, a shared understanding of the moment's significance and the unseen shift in dynamics. Even my daughter, though young, sensed the difference. She paused mid-activity, looking from me to my mother-in-law with a curious mixture of surprise and wonder. Children, sensitive to emotional and psychological shifts, can detect changes in the air that adults often overlook. Her instinctive reaction was one of quiet observation, noting the subtle tension in gestures, the recalibration in tone, and the unexpected calm that had replaced the usual undercurrents of manipulation. In her own way, she began to internalize the lesson of boundaries, respect, and the subtle but absolute assertion of authority. The consequences extended beyond individual reactions. They began to shape the collective behavior of the household. My mother-in-law, now fully aware of the text's impact, began to move with a cautious deliberation, measuring each word and action against the new, invisible lines of control. Conversations that might have once been laced with passive-aggressive undertones were now muted, calculated, and devoid of subtle intrusion. Her usual probing curiosity, which had often created tension and unease, was tempered by the knowledge that any overreach would be immediately noticeable and firmly addressed. The household, for the first time in years, felt a sense of equilibrium, albeit one that had been hard-won through strategy and patience. I observed how the shift in dynamics influenced my husband's behavior as well. With my mother-in-law's influence curtailed, he moved more freely, more authentically, without the subconscious need to mediate or navigate around her subtle pressures. Decisions that once required delicate negotiation now felt unburdened, executed with a sense of clarity and confidence. Even casual interactions, such as discussing household plans or scheduling family activities, carried a newfound directness, reflecting the underlying shift that had been catalyzed by the text. The consequences of the message also manifested in subtle psychological ways. My mother-in-law's attempts to regain control were met with immediate awareness and measured response, preventing escalation. Over time, I could see the recalibration of her expectations and behavior, not through confrontation, but through quiet acknowledgement of boundaries she could not cross. The text had established authority without conflict, proving that strategic action can be more powerful than prolonged argumentation. The invisible lines drawn were respected, sometimes reluctantly, yet consistently, and this created a new order in the household. Emotionally, the impact was profound. Years of subtle tension, anxiety, and silent negotiations had left traces on every family member. The text, seemingly simple, released a cascade of emotional recalibration. Relief washed over me. The anxiety that had accompanied daily interactions with my mother-in-law dissipated. The constant vigilance, the careful navigation of conversations, and the mental load of anticipating manipulation were suddenly eased. The household, while not devoid of emotion, now functioned under a sense of fairness, clarity, and respect that had long been absent. The effect on my mother-in-law was particularly nuanced. She exhibited a mixture of begrudging respect, subtle frustration, and reflective recalibration. Her gestures, once confident and unchallenged, now carried traces of careful deliberation. Each movement, each phrase, and each glance seemed measured, as though she were continuously assessing the boundaries she had just discovered. Yet within this tension, there was also a subtle recognition of the efficacy of strategic patience and precision, the quiet acknowledgement that overreach had consequences she could not override. Socially, the repercussions extended beyond immediate family members. During casual visits or interactions with extended family, the shift in household dynamics became subtly apparent. My mother-in-law's influence, once unquestioned in these settings, was now moderated, her comments more calculated and less likely to impose pressure. Friends and relatives who had witnessed the previous patterns of tension began to notice the calmer, more controlled interactions, unaware of the precise strategic action that had created the shift. The ripple effect extended silently, changing perceptions, behaviors, and expectations in ways that reinforced the new order. Even mundane activities became a reflection of the changed dynamics. Meals were shared with a quiet sense of balance. Conversations flowed without the previously persistent undertones of judgment or manipulation. Decisions regarding family matters were now approached with clarity and mutual respect, as the unspoken understanding of boundaries had become integrated into the daily rhythm of household life. The subtle authority established by the text influenced not just interactions, but the emotional texture of the home, transforming tension into controlled harmony. Internally, I reflected on the long-term consequences of this strategic act. The balance of power had shifted not through confrontation or anger, but through careful observation, planning, and precise action. My mother-in-law had been neutralized in a way that preserved dignity, minimized conflict, and maximized psychological impact. The family's emotional landscape had been recalibrated, ensuring that future interactions would occur within the framework of clearly defined boundaries, respect, and fairness. Over the following days, I observed the gradual unfolding of these consequences. My mother-in-law adapted to the new reality, cautiously testing boundaries, then retreating upon subtle correction. My husband, liberated from the subtle pressures of her influence, engaged more openly in household decisions. My daughter internalized lessons about fairness, respect, and the quiet assertion of authority. Even casual conversations reflected the recalibrated power dynamics. The consequences were not just immediate, they were enduring, transforming the very structure of family interaction and emotional life. The text had accomplished more than I could have hoped. It had addressed years of subtle manipulation, created clarity where ambiguity had thrived, and redefined authority in the household. Its impact was not confined to a single interaction. It had triggered a cascade of behavioral, emotional, and relational adjustments that would influence the family for months, if not years. The consequences, profound and multifaceted, demonstrated the power of strategic action, patience, and insight in resolving deeply entrenched family tensions. And yet, even with the immediate and long-term effects visible, the situation retained a subtle tension, a reminder that relationships are complex, dynamic, and ever-evolving. My mother-in-law, though restrained, remained a presence in our lives, capable of subtle influence and potential recalibration. The family consequences were clear, but the ongoing management of boundaries, trust, and emotional equilibrium would remain a quiet, ongoing process, a testament to the fact that in family dynamics, even decisive action is but one step in a continuing journey of negotiation, understanding, and strategic navigation. The household, now transformed by the ripple effect of a single, decisive text, settled into a deceptive calm. The shift in dynamics, though profound and irrevocable, was subtle in its outward manifestation. My mother-in-law moved through the house with an air of careful restraint, measuring her words and actions with a newfound consciousness. The immediate confrontation had passed, yet the psychological tension remained, hanging in the air like a quiet storm, unseen by the casual observer, but undeniable to anyone attuned to the delicate rhythms of family life. I watched her as she adjusted the photographs on the wall, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, and realized that the subtle recalibration of her authority was ongoing, quietly redefining every interaction she had with the family. Emotionally, the household had undergone a profound shift. My husband, liberated from years of indirect pressure and subtle manipulation, navigated conversations with a clarity that was new, almost exhilarating. He laughed more freely, spoke more openly, and made decisions without hesitation, demonstrating a confidence that had been stifled for far too long. The dynamics between him and my daughter, once nuanced and careful due to the undercurrents of tension, now flowed naturally, filled with warmth, affection, and an unspoken understanding that our family unit had evolved. Even my mother-in-law, while outwardly composed, exhibited subtle signs of internal recalibration, her gestures measured, her expressions flickering with restrained curiosity, and her words chosen with the precision of someone learning, perhaps for the first time, that control was no longer unilateral. I spent hours reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. The years of subtle challenges, covert observations, and delicate negotiations had converged into a single act of strategic clarity. The text had been more than a message. It had been an assertion of authority, a reinforcement of boundaries, and a carefully executed act of silent justice. It was a culmination of patience, reflection, and observation, delivered not through confrontation or anger, but through intelligence and precision. And yet, I knew that while the immediate effects were evident, the true long-term consequences would unfold slowly, subtly, and perhaps unpredictably as each family member internalized the new dynamics in their own way. There were moments of reflection that left me both satisfied and cautious. The satisfaction came from witnessing the immediate recalibration of household authority, the release of tension that had accumulated over years, and the clear acknowledgement of boundaries that had been so long ignored. But the caution was a reminder that family dynamics are never static. Even the most decisive action can trigger reactions that are delayed, indirect, or subtle. My mother-in-law, while temporarily restrained, remained a force to be reckoned with, a presence capable of influence, negotiation, and adaptation. The text had set the stage, but the play of family life was ongoing, filled with unpredictable movements, hidden agendas, and quiet recalibrations that could emerge at any moment. The suspense was heightened by the silent recalibrations taking place in the minds of each family member. My mother-in-law, though restrained, was clearly processing, analyzing, and strategizing in the quiet moments of reflection that followed the text. My husband, while liberated, was subtly aware of the lingering presence of his mother's influence and the delicate balance that would need to be maintained in the days, weeks, and months to come. My daughter, sensing the change but unaware of the intricate mechanics behind it, internalized lessons about boundaries, authority, and emotional intelligence, lessons that would shape her understanding of family relationships for years. Each interaction carried the weight of a silent recalibration, infusing even ordinary moments with tension, reflection, and awareness. As I observed the subtle changes, I began to reflect on the broader implications of this experience. The text had achieved more than just a personal victory. It had illustrated the power of strategy, patience, and insight in navigating complex family dynamics. I realized that true authority is not imposed through aggression or dominance, but through careful observation, deliberate action, and the quiet assertion of boundaries that are respected by all. The satisfaction of witnessing the immediate and tangible results of a single, decisive action was profound, yet it was accompanied by the humbling understanding that family relationships are intricate, dynamic, and ever-evolving. The suspense lingered because the story was far from over. My mother-in-law, for all her recalibrated restraint, remained a presence capable of influence, subtle pressure, and unexpected moves. The text had neutralized her immediate strategies, yet the future held countless opportunities for subtle maneuvers, quiet challenges, and silent negotiations. Every family gathering, casual conversation, and moment of decision carried the potential for new dynamics to emerge, reminding me that the equilibrium achieved was delicate, temporary, and dependent on constant awareness. The lingering suspense was not a result of conflict, but a recognition that family life, like a living organism, continuously adapts, evolves, and surprises. In the quiet moments, I found myself reflecting on the lessons this experience had provided. The text, while simple in form, had carried immense weight, its impact demonstrating the effectiveness of strategy over reaction, patience over confrontation, and insight over emotion. I realized that the balance of power, respect, and emotional intelligence within a family is rarely static. It requires continuous attention, careful consideration, and subtle recalibration. Each member of the household had been subtly reshaped by the act, creating a ripple effect that would influence interactions, decisions, and relationships long after the initial message had been read. Yet, even as I considered these reflections, the lingering suspense was undeniable. My mother-in-law's presence, though momentarily restrained, remained a quiet reminder of the unpredictability inherent in family dynamics. Her future actions, whether subtle manipulations, cautious tests of boundaries, or deliberate provocations, were unknown. The text had shifted the balance, but it had not eliminated the potential for new challenges, recalibrations, or revelations. The story was far from finished. The threads of tension, authority, and influence continued to weave themselves through the fabric of our daily lives, creating a dynamic, ever-changing tapestry of family interaction. The final reflection was both sobering and empowering. The power of a single, deliberate action had been proven. The text had redefined authority, enforced boundaries, and catalyzed change, but the ongoing management of relationships required vigilance, patience, and strategic awareness. The satisfaction of immediate results was tempered by the understanding that family dynamics are complex, fluid, and endlessly evolving. The suspense was not merely external. It resided in the interplay of personalities, emotions, and unspoken expectations that would continue to shape our lives. As I sat quietly, observing the subtle shifts, I realized that the true lesson extended beyond my immediate family. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and the intelligent application of strategy in any complex interpersonal dynamic. The text had acted as a catalyst, but the unfolding consequences, the recalibration of authority, and the lingering suspense were the living proof that relationships are a continuous, intricate negotiation, a delicate balance of power, respect, and emotional intelligence that must be maintained with care and insight. And in that stillness, I understood the ultimate truth. The story had reached a temporary closure, yet the suspense remained, quietly pulsating beneath the surface, reminding me that in family dynamics, even decisive action is only one chapter in an ever-evolving narrative. The text had changed everything, yet the future, unpredictable and full of subtle possibility, awaited with quiet anticipation.